third and final session of today's Conservative Home Defence and Security Conference, where we're joined by an eminent panel for this very important discussion on a global approach to defence, from cybersecurity to AUKUS and NATO. I'll be your chairman for this session. For those of us who haven't met, my name is Mark Wallace. I'm the Chief Executive of Total Politics Group, the group of which Conservative Home is a part. And I'm very pleased to see so many of you here to join us. I know a lot of people also tuning in live online through our site and YouTube as well. So welcome to you. Benjamin Franklin famously said, immediately after signing the US Declaration of Independence, we must all hang together or we shall all hang separately. And in many ways, that continues to be the crucial and vital theme of international alliances, particularly in the free world. I think we can see an even more stark illustration, of course, in the last 12 and a bit months of the simple fact that the more free states there are in the world, the harder it is for any individual state to be imperiled. The closer their alliances and cooperation, the more likely they are to be able to more robustly initially deter a threat and then to defend against one when one arises. And that theme of the interconnectivity of defence, be it bilateral alliances, multilateral alliances, formal treaty organisations, thematic organisations and cooperation like Five Eyes, through, of course, to NATO, the most successful defensive alliance in human history. And I think one of the things we'd very much like to explore in this session with our expert panel is where are threats developing towards, where do we see emerging threats, and how ought we to manage our international relations and defence alliances and cooperation in advance of them. What formats of alliance, traditional or innovative, are the most appropriate for the coming years, and what are we learning as we're going along from the changing shape and the changing function of those different forms of alliance, those different types of cooperation, regionally, thematically, and so on, that we can apply for the future. So I hope you'll join me in giving a very warm welcome to our first speaker. Simon Fell, MP, is the chair of the Cybersecurity APPG. He'll be known to many of you in the room. Obviously, in that APPG role, he has a particular focus on cyber, but I know he also takes, of course, a wider interest in our international relations, defence and security too. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much, Mark. And very good to see you all here on a Monday. We are now in the afternoon, Monday afternoon. I'll only speak briefly because I think I'd like to hear from the other panellists and perhaps get into Q&A. But I'm fortunate enough to be the MP for Barrow and Furness. And for those of you who don't know Barrow, Barrow is where we build the UK's submarines. So we are currently in production on 2 Astute-class submarines. The last 2 to get out the door, HMS Anson left a fortnight ago. And we are producing the next generation of Trident there, so the Dreadnought programme, which steel was cut on the 3rd of those boats a few weeks ago too. The SSNR programme, that's the next generation of hunter-killer subs, is being designed in Barrow as we speak. And then, of course, whatever happens with AUKUS, one of the topics for discussion today, Barrow will play a key part in that, whether that is physical build, whether it is technology transfer, whether it is skills transfer. So we have a bright future ahead of us, but we have challenges with that as well. And I think the biggest one for me as a constituency MP is skilling up people and making sure that we are resilient on that front. Ben, who just spoke to you, announced a few weeks ago that we are moving from 11,000 people in the shipyard in Barrow to 17,000 people. That is a huge opportunity, a huge number of people working in this programme who will be highly skilled. But building up those numbers is tough, and these aren't jobs where you can start from scratch. We need to accrue skills that last for a very, very long time. And whilst as the constituency MP for Barrow, I would always argue that, of course, you would want to live in Barrow rather than Adelaide. I can understand why some people, depending on how the AUKUS announcement goes, may make a different decision. So there's also an argument for levelling up in there as well and making communities like mine, which I will be generous to Barrow. It is a long way from anywhere and quite difficult to get to. We've got to make it more attractive. We have a challenge in that we have the fastest declining population in the UK there. Young people leave us and old people, unfortunately, leave us too. So we need to do more to attract and retain. And I think there's a whole of government effort that's needed there when we're talking about these national endeavours for our national security and our partners' national security to look at how we actually deliver these on a sustainable basis. And then I also chair the all-party group on cyber, as Mark has mentioned. And this is the one that keeps me up at night. There are a plethora of threats here. And I wonder whether we have the right forums nationally and internationally to share what we need to protect each other. It's often said, I spent a decade before I came into politics working in fraud, financial crime, and to a degree cyber, that you're only as strong as your weakest link. And frankly, there are an awful lot of weakest links in the cyberspace. Through my work in Parliament, I spend quite a lot of time talking to international politicians. We had a CPA conference, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association conference in Parliament only a few months ago, and I was struck by the number of countries who have strong democracies, operate under the rule of law, who are really worried about what they are facing into on the cyber front. And they look at us with a considerable degree of envy. They look at the National Cyber Security Centre, they look at Cheltenham, and they're asking for help. And some of that help's available, and we don't signpost it particularly well. But sometimes I think we could be doing more, and this is something we should be leaning into as global Britain, selling our expertise here and selling it as a real opportunity for countries to lean in and share with us. Because as we've seen with ransomware attacks such as NotPetya and others, an attack on one, no matter where that is, becomes an attack on us all. So I think there is a piece of work to be done, a significant piece of work to be done to make us all more resilient there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Simon. Our next speaker is Professor Malcolm Chalmers. He's the Deputy Director General of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, the preeminent think tank on matters defence and security. He directs its portfolio of research on contemporary defence and security issues, but is also the founding director of RUSI's proliferation and nuclear policy team. So is here. I think we're extremely fortunate to get your wide-ranging expertise on this topic. I know a lot of people here are very, very keen to hear what you have to say.
Great.
Over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mark, and it's good to see quite a number of familiar faces in the audience. I thought I'd take up your invitation to talk a little bit about alliances and put out some questions which we can then discuss further. Of course, since the end of empire, the UK has had alliances, partnerships with other countries at the centre of its defence policy, whether it's during the Cold War, whether it's in the Afghan, Iraq and Balkan interventions, or now confronting Russian aggression in Ukraine. We do it with others. We depend on others just as they depend on us. And that's partly about organisations. It's about the central role that NATO has in our defence policy. It's about the importance we attach to the United Nations. It's now increasingly the interesting role, which we will see how it develops in relation to AUKUS as an important procurement partnership with Australia and the United States. And over this last year, the G7 has really come back as a very important forum through which all the Western countries cooperate very closely together, and I think that's really proven its worth in this crisis. The UK partnership with the European Union has also been strengthened during this crisis. We've begun to move perhaps a bit beyond the referendum debate, and now, particularly in relation to sanctions, but actually in a wide range of areas, we're cooperating more and more, making sure we deconflict training provision and the military aid provision we are each giving to Ukraine. And although the UK is the biggest single European funder of the Ukrainian war effort, the EU collectively spends something around 3 times as much as we do on aid to Ukraine. And of course, the United States spends 10 times as much as we do on military aid to Ukraine. So it's a collective effort. And the reason, a central element in our success or failure, God forbid, will be continuing that unity. But you know, alliances aren't only about organizations, they're also about states. And it's about the centrality of our relations with our key partners in the United States, in Europe, and indeed increasingly more broadly. That's absolutely key. It's both a great benefit to our security, but it's a potential vulnerability to our security. We in the UK, along with other Europeans, were helpless when President Trump and then President Biden decided to pull out of Afghanistan. What was a NATO mission was effectively ended by a unilateral American decision, which many of its allies opposed. And we now see, and maybe those of you who've been reading the reports from the Conservative, I think Conservative Political Action Committee conference, if I'm not mistaken, the title, over the last weekend, and Donald Trump's speech yesterday, but also the widespread commentary across at least that wing of the Republican Party, highly critical of the level of America's support to Ukraine. Really, I think, quite concerning as we move into the primary season towards the end of this year in the United States. And it's certainly not yet clear whether the Republican leadership in the House, which of course has a very heavy say in American funding for the war effort in Ukraine, will be willing to push back against the pressure they are now feeling from that wing of the Republican Party. So there are issues of dependency in relation to the United States on Ukraine as well. Although for my money, so far, the United States has struck broadly the right balance in its approach to the war, both seeking to help Ukraine survive in the first instance, but also push back Russian aggression on the one hand, but also doing what they can to avoid escalation to a wider war, so rejecting ideas for a no-fly zone, for example, which would have led to direct confrontation between Western and Russian forces. So I think that the United States has broadly led the alliance in a clever way over this period. I think if I were to nitpick, I would say they could have moved towards more capable weapon systems, led the debate a bit more sharply last summer than they have done. They've been perhaps rather slow in that regard. But broadly, I think they're broadly in the right place. What, of course, and I'm sure the Secretary of State talked about this earlier, what I'm sure that war so far has revealed very strongly is the lack of depth that our country, or even our American partners, most of those involved in the conflict, in fact, have had in terms of sustainability for a protracted, high-intensity war, something which will take a long time to address. But in many ways, this is as much a war of production as it is a trench warfare. It's production war as much as trench war. And for all the talk of new wars, production of artillery shells is more important than production of drones or cyberbots. They're all important, but if you don't have the artillery, if you don't have the ammunition, if you don't have the missiles, then you're in real trouble. And that's, of course, we can discuss further in the session, but that's really important. The final point maybe to make by way of introduction is that we need to be prepared for further shocks. Things in the war will not continue as they have done, but we don't know how they will change. But I think in many regards it's remarkable, I think, that there hasn't been further escalation in this war so far. But we saw a flurry in the last 2 or 3 weeks about reports that China was considering supplying artillery shells to Russia, which Russia increasingly needs. Of course, it now appears that that story came from a Russian source, rather than the Chinese source, so one can see why Russians might want that story to get around. But certainly if it were to transpire, it would, I think, have quite a radical effect on US-China and even more so European-Chinese relations, but it hasn't happened yet. Finally, I think let's remember that in an alternative but all too plausible reality, right now we could be bemoaning the first anniversary of Putin's victory parade through Kiev. It came very close. His theory of victory was always massively risky, but it was not entirely implausible. If the Ukrainian leadership had been assassinated in that first week, if they'd done a bit better in terms of destroying Ukrainian air defenses in the north as they did in the south, if Ukrainian morale had collapsed after the end of their, after the assassination of their leadership, we could now, not perhaps the end of the war, but we would be thinking, as our analysts were. I mean, when our analysts, by the end of November, December, we, I think, already thought that the invasion was highly likely. But all the talk was about how to support a Ukrainian insurgency, not about Ukrainian conventional forces actually doing what they actually did, pushing back Russian forces from large parts of its territory. So, and it's a testament, of course, to the bravery and skill of Ukrainian soldiers, and indeed the Ukrainian population, that we achieved what they've achieved, what they have done so far. And I think we in the UK can take some considerable credit from being one of the countries which was first to support the Ukrainians even before the major invasion in February last year, and continuing to do so. But there's a lot of trouble ahead. It's going to be a very uncertain year. And any talk you hear sometimes that Ukrainians are about to roll over Russia in the next 4 or 5 months, I think we're still a long way from that, I'm afraid. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Malcolm. Yes, I remember almost exactly a year ago writing a column about whether the West was prepared psychologically, politically, and logistically for supporting a long insurgent war, which again, particularly with things like, I think if you were in that circumstance now, even then, I think Donald Trump's remarks at CPAC, the potential change in the US government would be even more impactful and dangerous at that point, because you would have much more, a much more imperiled, even more imperiled situation. I think much more for us to discuss in the Q&A afterwards. Thank you. And our third and final speaker on the panel is Donna Gavin. She's the founder of Digital Tories, a group intended to create a home for digitally minded technologists in politics and lead thought leadership in that field. She's also, I think I might say, a 10-year veteran of the British Armed Forces, including with specialism in cyber in that field too. So has dual relevant focuses for this panel. Please give her a warm welcome.
Good afternoon, and one of the reasons why it's particularly special for me to be on a stage like this today is in the early noughties, when I first signed up to serve in the Royal Signals, we were very much an afterthought, and technology was not something that you'd expect the Secretary of State to sit here and have the forefront of their opening remarks. And so I've lived through this evolution for technology and cyber being something that sort of just happens to being an absolute focus. And so for someone like me to be on a stage and discuss it today is a real milestone. I'll focus my opening remarks on two main aspects. And first of all, to touch on the concept, I guess, of partnerships in defence. And today I'd like to perhaps bring to life what some of those working relationships are. I know there were some concerns about the impact on our international placing or our ability to collaborate following Brexit and other political situations. But at a working level, I think credit is in those strong professional working relationships, and how at the Five Eyes level, that sort of sharing of information has never faltered. In fact, I've lived through a thematic change from just sharing information with our counterparts to be able to share capabilities. And we've seen that particularly in the cyberspace, where we're not constrained by borders and geography, whereby we can share capabilities and infrastructure to a greater degree. Of course, that's technologically possible, but there are lots of other kind of knotty constraints around regulation and law, which I've kind of skipped over in that description. But that's a completely different way at looking at how we collaborate, much less physical, and moving to a much more digital collaboration, which is far more achievable internationally with our partners. The second part I'd like to focus on, I guess, is our role in the world, and what I see, world according to me, what I see kind of our position, particularly in the realms of cybersecurity. And I think we can absolutely be a leader. There's two things I think are required to become for leadership in the cybersecurity space, and that's first is technical credibility, and the second is the ability to bring the international community together. And I'll touch on those very briefly. On technical credibility, well, that's really about the skills of our workforce, and we know that we have that here with our cyber corridor along the M4 and our effective partnerships with industry. But we also know that we're particularly well placed at bringing the international community together, because the cybersecurity challenge is not one for an individual nation to face on their own. We live in a world of pretty much a giant game of whack-a-mole. We're constrained by regulations, and the ability for us to come together to be able to counter the threat is really the only way to progress in the cybersecurity space. I think there's a few things we need to be able to get right in order to be able to do that. And I think in respect of our vision around digital strategy, my concern from a partisan perspective is that we don't necessarily have a strong voice in what is the conservative way in our digital vision. That's one of the reasons why Digital Tories was founded, to try and hold at least that conversation. My fear is the left have a much more mature narrative around the digital strategy and our digital vision, and less so from a conservative perspective. On that bombshell, I'll probably end my opening remarks there.
Thank you very much. Now, we have, I believe, just over half an hour for questions. I'm sure there'll be quite a few in the room. As usual, the House rules apply, so please do, after I pick you out, wait for my colleague, one of my colleagues to arrive with a microphone. Please say who you are and where you're from, and please make sure it is an actual question. As I always say at these things, if it is a speech, I will at some point have to boo you until you find a question mark to append to the end of it. However, I'm going to use my kind of tyrannical power as chair to ask a question of my own first. Malcolm, this is probably, I'll start with you on this, and I welcome both other panellists' views. When we're looking at the formats of different forms of organisation, one of those you mentioned was the United Nations. Obviously there you have a structure with the permanent membership of the Security Council, which was designed for a very specific point in time, very specific world when people were adjusting to particularly kind of nuclear multipolarity as well in its early years. We now have a position where we have a land war in Europe in which the aggressor has a Security Council veto. How functional is that as a system? Aside from, does it mean that United Nations effectively in full remains a useful organisation, but the Security Council is fundamentally impaired? And is there any prospect for improving it?
It's an excellent question. I think
thank you.
First, that's always what you do say when the question's a difficult one. I think one of the things we have to remember is that for most of the United Nations history, it coincided with the Cold War. So we had a situation from 1949 or so onwards until 1990, where the Soviet Union had that veto and exercised it whenever it wished. And therefore, on many of the issues where the major powers disagreed, there was a deadlock. We had a brief period immediately after the end of the Cold War in which Russia was less prepared to challenge the United States. And things happened for a period, but even that didn't last that long. By the sort of early mid-Putin years, increasingly, it wasn't that United Nations wasn't able to get consensus. It didn't have consensus on the Kosovo war, for example, although it did on Bosnia. But so I think its value is more limited in those scenarios. But actually having that forum which every country in the world is represented has a powerful value. I think the fact that we have General Assembly discussions where every state in the world votes in relation to Russia, and that's quite a powerful diplomatic tool. But I think like any international organization, in the end, it can't replace state sovereignty. And the question, I think, isn't, can the UN replace NATO? It can't. Can it replace the G7? It can't. Is it a useful complement to that? Yes, it is. Is it important to an organization where every state is represented? Yes, it is. And I think that if your imagination is trying to think about, can we create an organization where the only people in it are states who we fundamentally agree with? Well, we've got that in relation to G7 and NATO. We've got those organizations already, but we also, I think, need an inclusive organization. And I guess the other organization which perhaps fits in that category is the G20. The G20 can absolutely not replace the G7. And there was a stage at which people talked about that, but I think that was always nonsense. But it is an important forum in which we can have the Indonesians and the Brazilians and the South Africans and so on in the room with us. We don't always agree. We very often disagree, but we can still find ways to cooperate in things where we can agree, because even with this war going on and the way in which China has lent quite heavily in the Russian side, there are still issues on which we can cooperate with the Chinese. We have to cooperate with them on climate. We cooperate with them in many aspects of trade, even as we have real deterrence is the modus operandi in many other ways. So very long-winded way of saying we shouldn't overestimate the UN's role, but we shouldn't underestimate it either.
Thank you. I don't know if either of the other panelists would like to come in. There we go. We've settled that one. It's always good. We'll start with a question here.
Thank you. Julian Brazier. Two, if I may, very closely linked questions. Malcolm's been part of the team that has taken RUSI up to the point where it is now the dominant defence and foreign affairs think tank. At this time, with so much going on, what else needs to happen to get the nation as a whole thinking about defence as a top priority and really thinking about it? And the second question is to our two Conservative people here. What do you both think we need to do to start to join up again with the Republican Party in America so that the debate, which seems to be happening almost in two different universes on the same subjects in America and this side of the Atlantic, starts to join up again, and the voices in the Republican Party, which could end up pulling, as Malcolm hinted, could end up pulling the rug out from Ukraine completely, actually hear some of our point of view.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the second of those questions. Simon and Don.
Thank you. The easy question to start with then. So I think we need to divorce to a degree the fluff and the noise of politics and the hard yards of actually getting the job done. And AUKUS is a really good example of this. So beyond the rhetoric, we have now three nations, the US, us, and Australia, working really hard in terms of trying to figure out what deep integration looks like for physical manufacture of submarines, but also cyber capability, future-proofing ourselves against AI threats and other threats in that domain. This is going on full stack, and from the top of the Department of Defense and the top of the MOD, right down to those who are actually doing the doing. This is really important, and it's the kind of framework that will set us up for the next generation, and will also, crucially, with Australia's partnership in there, provide a bulwark against aggression in the South China Sea. So we shouldn't just look at Donald Trump and worry about the future. I think sensible heads are allowing this sort of integration and this sort of partnership to prevail. But in terms of the political side of things, I mean, we can't just walk away from them. You know, we need to keep these relationships up. I remember at the start of the Ukraine, or the illegal invasion of Ukraine, being on a call with the Defense Secretary, and he said, you know, one of the most helpful things that came to me during the sort of the opening hours of this was I actually knew quite a few of the key players in the region, and he knew them through partnerships, through attending various interparliamentary schemes and all that, and he'd form friendships with them, and it meant he could pick up the phone to them and have a conversation with them. You know, we can't allow those sorts of relationships to atrophy across the pond just because we don't particularly like the cut of Donald Trump's jib at the moment. And if I can just take a little bit of your first question as well, about defence rising up the agenda. I think actually one of the things we need to do is look at it beyond sort of the headline images that we tend to talk about defence in. So we have a gap of 14,000 people year after year in terms of cyber skills. We are not filling them. And there's an opportunity to engage a new generation of people on this from primary schools up, where we start to get them involved far more heavily in STEM, where we use the Gatsby benchmarks to try and link, you know, young people to jobs that they can not just aspire to, but they can see themselves in. This is absolutely crucial, because if we want to stay at the forefront of maintaining the sort of skills we need, if we want to stay as a world leader in defence, then we need to look not just at boat, ships, aeroplanes, you know, physical people in Army, Navy, and Air Force. We need to look at the skills that support those people and the battlefronts of the future too.
Touch on the second part of your question and take it to perhaps broaden out slightly to the theme of interoperability, so how we work, I suppose in detail at the working level with partners. Relationships-wise, I think we can sort of park and say that works and that's strong and there's lots of ambition, collective ambition, but at the working technical level, there's always been challenges. And if I can bring that to life slightly, that in a time where we want to deploy or exercise our armed forces together with whether it's the US or another ally, there are some real big technical blockers in doing so. Not least do our radios not talk to each other. We have many different types of ammunition which stretches our supply chains. And so for all these reasons, it becomes quite hard work to be able to work together. And so I see an opportunity as we collectively come together around cybersecurity and what that means for us both as allies. And that's about designing in some of those workable, making it more workable, but designing out crime and opportunities from adversaries, because we're still very much at the design phase. I'll be a bit more specific if I can. When we talk about interoperability around this, we're talking about things like skills, which Simon rightly brought to life around, and I think it's quite different, particularly in cybersecurity, unlike perhaps other facets of defence and security, in that we share those skills with industry. So, yes, some skills across defence you might share, but to a lesser degree, but we're really competing with industry for those same finite resources and finite skills base. The second part is about our standards, and specifically our internet standards. I want to see the West take the lead in designing and leading what those internet standards are. There's a real fear that a country like China might get ahead of the game slightly on these internet standards, which means it will become quite problematic for us. What that really means is it could end up in being a surveillance net. And what we want to make sure is that we balance that privacy and security, and we have a Western approach in order to do so. And then latterly, I think that partnership with industry. I'd like to see us be a bit more outwardly project those kind of reliances on industry. And as I sort of described before, not only do we share this skills base, but also that capability development. It's not just ours to own. It's a shared challenge, and we have shared goals with industry around certain aspects of cyber defence, but I'd like us to see us go further.
And on the transatlantic side of things, is there a US equivalent of digital Tories that you hear from, or is that a...
Good test. Not to my knowledge, no.
So it might be telling in itself.
Yeah, okay.
Malcolm.
Sure, well, great questions, Julian. On the first one, I mean, and in a way, it's a question that's even more for politicians than it is for think tankers. But I think one observation I would make is that you have to make defence relevant to people's everyday lives and their perception of their own interests and the interests of their country. The more that defence is seen as something that we do because we want to be a force for good, and it sounds rather altruistic and maybe even a little naive at times when there's so many other competing economic pressures. But we don't primarily invest in our defence or indeed our foreign policy in order to be a force for good. We do it primarily because we want to defend British interests, and it's important for that to have strong defences, but also to have strong alliances, because we know, as we've discussed already, that without alliances we would be much more vulnerable. So that's the first thing. I think second, as part of that, I think there has to be more focus on resilience, national security resilience. After this long period of expeditionary warfare, where war is something we've fought a long way away in the Balkans or in Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever, maybe we got the impression that we in the UK would only be affected marginally. Maybe in the war of terror there would be some terrorist attacks, but today, one of my colleagues at RUSI produced a report, I think last week, Justin Bronk, on modernisation priorities for the Royal Air Force. And one of the strong points he makes there is that you're talking about preparing for peer conflict with Russia or a comparable power, then the UK homeland is vulnerable too. If you don't invest in your air bases to make sure that they're resilient, if you don't, in a way which countries near to Russia have done for a long time. I mean, you can learn an awful lot from the Swedes in terms of how you organize an air force against Russia. And that's maybe more broadly, because I think if you talk more about homeland resilience against military threats, but also maybe cyber threats and other threats, Simon referred to that, then that begins to bring it home to people. But of course, you have to do it in a way which is realistic. You can't do it around the possibility that the UK will be invaded, which you can if you're a Finn or a Pole, but that's not realistic in the UK. But that doesn't mean the UK would be immune if there were to be a conventional war. We would be affected, and I think we need to bring that home. If I may, in terms of the other question, all I would say in relation to that is that the possibility of a future American president being much less committed to the transatlantic alliance and being more anti-globalist, as Trump would describe it, is something which we will have to live with as the UK. No matter who the American president is, we will have to live with it. But as we did during the first Trump presidency. But I think it does enhance the value of diversified security partnerships. I mean, I actually think that the agreement with Japan and Italy in global combat air is of really quite great significance, and it illustrates the way in which there's a lot we can do in terms of building cooperation with Japan and Australia and South Korea and our European neighbours. So if we are faced with an American president in future who is less sympathetic, then we haven't put all our eggs in one basket. We have a diversity of security partnerships.
Gentleman over there, and then the lady here.
My name is Robert Morland. I'm a former member of the European Parliament, and I come from Gloucester. My question really is, I think, addressed specifically to Mr. Chalmers, because he talked about Ukraine. We, of course, always started off with Ukraine realizing there was a ceiling on our activities by the fact that obviously we didn't want a nuclear war or a world war. Recent comments have suggested we are moving a bit higher than we originally expected. So my question quite simply, how much can we raise the roof?
Raising the roof before you blow it off. Welcome.
I mean, it's an important question. And I think what's happened over the last year is that the United States, as the leader of the alliance, but all of us collectively, have been testing the water. We've been boiling the frog slowly, if you like. And steps we are now taking, which we were not prepared to take a year ago, are partly a result of learning where we think Russia's escalation thresholds are. But also, of course, a really important part of Western approach to this war has been to send very clear deterrent signals to Russia as to what the possible consequences would be if they cross some thresholds. So they are deterring us, and we're deterring them. But it's a complex game of deterrence, which we're all guessing a bit. We're all trying to deceive each other, perhaps a bit. And the stakes are very high indeed. A good example of that today would be that there's been some revival of reports that Russia will buy medium-range or medium-range ballistic missiles from Iran, of which Iran has significant stocks, and Russia's running out of many of its missile stocks. And what was interesting about the report was in part that, and I don't know whether this is the case, but the Americans were making it clear to the Russians that if this were to take place, then the Americans would lift its current restrictions on longer-range ATACMS missiles, supplying them to Ukraine. Similarly, in relation to Chinese supply of artillery, which again is out there as a possibility, the Americans have been sending some pretty clear messages to the Chinese about what the potential consequences of that would be. So deterrence is operating at every level right now. It doesn't mean it will succeed. What I am clear about is that the Americans are very clear that right now, American or NATO forces as a whole, the Americans are policing NATO quite heavily in this, that they will not start something which means a direct confrontation of Western forces and Russian forces, and I think quite rightly so. If Russia ever were to use a nuclear weapon, then I suspect that restriction would be removed. But as long as they don't do that, well, and there may be other things which Russia could do which could also cross that threshold. So, as I said towards the end of my remarks, I think there are still many ways in which this could escalate. In some ways, it's quite remarkable it hasn't escalated more than it has done, and we need to be very wary of it, because when I was talking about RAF bases in the UK, you can be sure if there were a conventional war between Russia and NATO, then UK territory would itself be affected.
Donna, what's your view on this? And also, how does it impact on, for example, the field of cyber warfare, where you have somewhere where one might think that there are decades-long established expectations in Washington or Moscow or London about what a conventional act of war might look like. We've seen quite a lot of debate in recent years when there have been alleged cyber attacks on NATO members. Do they contravene Article 5? At what point do people decide that a threshold's been crossed in what is still quite a changing field? Indeed,
I think we've seen a real shift in the narrative around, so if I go back to perhaps my service in Afghanistan, where although as an adversary they were far more technologically capable than maybe one would assume, it certainly is a different type of adversary. So I think the Russian-Ukraine conflict has been, if anything, a turn on the handle of capability development around cyber and cybersecurity. And the reason why I say that is it's a far more technologically advanced adversary. I've been pleased to see we've shifted our approach, and we've become, us and our allies become more comfortable showing our cards around cyber and intelligence, and how we've disseminated insight from the intelligence community to really shape the narrative around Russia, to be able to counter some of their false flag operations. And let's be clear that Russia may not have, allies may be a strong word, but they have sympathizers globally. And so for us, the positioning to always counter and remind the world and to be that kind of constant in what is the truth and be able to share some of that insight and show our cards slightly more than maybe what we feel comfortable doing. It's there's lots of sensitivities about sharing intelligence, and we've been far more comfortable in this conflict than perhaps with any others who have gone before.
Thank you, and I think Donna's actually spot on with this. So I think there's a few points here, which is trying to understand what cyber actually means. So there are a range of threats. We can be talking about misinformation and disinformation. We could be talking about the physical infrastructure, the cables under the sea that allow the internet to work for us. These are all in the cyber domain. They're all things we need to be concerned about. And in terms of how we address this as a threat and how we respond, I think we're in really early days yet. So if you are Russia or China and you want to spend 3 years probing our power stations and learning how to attack them and executing a substantial cyber attack to shut down a critical piece of national infrastructure, then you can do that. But you show your hand and you declare that it is you and there is a sanction against you as a result of that. Actually isn't a more effective piece of cyber warfare just causing chaos, which is relatively easy to do. If you shut down, Ocado will not end the world, but if you shut down Ocado and the delivery companies and end the Royal Mail's ability to get parcels to you and shut down the GP appointment booking system, imagine the impact that would have on society. And you can do that through third-party actors and not link that to the actions of the state. So we need to understand as a country and as groupings of countries, how we respond to those sorts of lower level threats. And I think there's just one more point I'd make on this as well, which is we are leaning into these things almost blind. If we really, really want to face up to some of the challenges we've got, then we have to build resilience. This is the key thing. And resilience isn't just about protecting ourselves. We've got some excellent capabilities here. It is about making sure that our allies are protected. It's about making sure that we've got the long skills chain in the UK to protect ourselves too. And I'm just not convinced we're in the right place in this. There's bits of legislation we need to tweak. I see friends over there who will argue that Computer Misuse Act is something that's holding us back, and they are right. But we've got to get our own legislation in place. We've got to make sure that we are training people up, and we've got to make sure that we are training our allies up so we can all be resilient against the threats of the future.
I confess to a couple of delivery companies that had they suffered a Russian cyber attack, I'm not sure I would notice a lot of difference in terms of them getting parcels to my actual house. They'll remain nameless. Lady here and then the gentleman at the back.
Verona Hulse from British cyber firm NCC Group. It won't surprise you to know that I totally agree that the UK has a lot to offer in terms of cyber expertise to export. I would be interested on that subject to understand the panellists' view of what the UK's strategy should be for middle ground countries, and within that, the role of cyber capacity building initiatives and that kind of thing.
Thank you. Simon, can we come to you?
So, really important question. So, I mentioned the Computer Misuse Act. So we are currently operating under a piece of legislation that existed when, I don't know if anyone will remember these, CompuServe CDs were coming through your door to get you on the internet. It is an ancient piece of legislation, but yet it defines actually how we can probe systems, how our security people can make sure they are robust. That desperately needs updating. There is a consultation at the moment about that. I hope we can move that forward quite quickly. the cyber skills piece, I won't retread what I've already said. There are some really good programs operating on this. So, you know, Cyber First scheme, Cyber 912 scheme, they are good. They're not wide enough. You know, we need to skill people up, and very quickly. And I think, you know, to the point that was made earlier, we need to link very clearly what the jobs and the capacity is in this space to the people who are working their way through our schools at the moment. This isn't just about people who can code. We need people who understand the law, who can work on a policy front, who can go and address schools and talk to them as well. It is not just about sitting in front of a computer with zeros and ones running in front of you. This is a threat we're all facing, but we have to get the people through the doors if we're going to face up to that challenge properly.
Donna, you touched on this a bit earlier in terms of that interconnection between state capacity, military personnel capacity, private sector, internationally. I remember talking to someone who had run a unit in the IDF in this field, who said that his biggest problem was that the people who worked for him kept becoming millionaires because they kept inventing apps and going off and retiring in their 20s, which sounds like quite a nice problem to have kind of as an economy, but is presumably quite a big challenge with the limited workforce with the requisite skills.
Indeed, and I think we still live in a time where computer science is still the most highly paid degree after leaving university. So when we talk about defence being sort of competing for that skills base, that's really what we mean. It's a demanding industry. But I'd like to touch a little bit on the point around capacity building. And actually, I would take a much more kind of national view on the benefit of being able to do that. I kind of flip it on its head slightly to say we know one thing for sure, that we can't win cyberspace on our own. We can be as advanced as we would like to be, but we still won't win the global overcome the global threats. And let me try and describe a little bit why that is. That we live in a world where there's different jurisdictions, and so cyber criminals will always take advantage for the country or the kind of regional area that is the most permissive to be able to reroute through. So, the more we can reroute the threat, the more we can kind of disassociate where that threat has come from. And so by squashing or being able to lift up the quality of regulation, of skills and abilities in cybersecurity for our allies, but further from our allies. This is a real global threat. And the more we can lift up the baseline, the more we can close down some of those avenues of threats, or threat vectors that we face. So actually, I think there's something about capacity building, yes, but actually there's a huge benefit to us. We can't do this alone, and we must bring our allies and furthermore globally with us.
Well, I agree entirely with that. I would just add one footnote. One of the biggest cyber threats we face in this country right now is ransomware. Mm-hmm. And the vast majority of ransomware comes from organizations and individuals based in Russia. And it really relates to your point, Simon, that the Russian state allows, perhaps to some extent, profits from this activity, partly because they want to create nuisance and disruption. It doesn't mean they're going to bring down the British state or whoever they're attacking with this, but it just makes things a little bit more difficult, and the more difficult they make things for us, the more they like it. There's a lot of cooperation we can do with many like-minded states, but in the end, countries like Russia who do not want to cooperate are a real problem, and we just have to do the best we can.
I think we had a question at the back of the room.
Ed Plunkett, with me. We're a digital skills company supporting Five Eyes. My question supports the discussion around skills, and I think it's really directed at Simon. So the Chinese are creating cyber operatives in about 93 days, and they're doing that through psychometric and aptitude testing. They're not totally focused on university degrees and what people did at school. So the barriers to entry are very low. Are we doing anything here to really focus how we fast-track people into the civil service? So whether that be the intelligence and communications organizations on a national level, and are we also looking at how we can improve the vetting system with our security vetting system, whether particularly in the DV and SC space?
So,
What's the answer I should give? That's an interesting question. I will make an unusual comment for a politician in that I'm not sure I'm the best qualified person to answer that question. I know we're doing a lot in this space, but I think the answer is not enough. I can't answer in detail most of the points you made, but I think one of the big challenges, and it has come up on the panel already, is around pay. So we are currently looking at a limited pool of people who hop between, well, I say hop between, they tend to hop from the public sector to the private sector. And the private sector simply can't meet their salaries, and that is a real challenge. So we have a training ground in the public sector that people then leave. Buying those skills back in at a high level is hugely challenging. So I think that there is a very strong argument to say in this space in particular, we need to lift the levels of civil service pay so we can attract people in and cross-pollinate. Some countries do this really well. So some of the Nordic countries second people in from industry and have that as a sort of regular program of activity. We should be looking at that, certainly. But it is a difficult thing for us to be looking at. I'm on the Home Affairs Committee, and we were in with the Met a few days ago, and they were making exactly this point. When they're doing investigations, they really struggle. And they struggle, A, because they have vacancies in the team, but because halfway through an investigation, people may leave to go and be better paid at Microsoft or wherever it may be. So we need to be alive to that threat if we're going to be able to answer that threat.
Yes, good question. So I'd like to touch first of all around kind of what we're doing to, I guess, to kind of uplift. And I'm going to use a D word that I think is really important, and that's building diversity into our skills base. And that's not for any sort of soft reason, and let me describe why that is. That when you are trying to protect an infrastructure or trying to understand where your adversary has routed through a threat, in order to do that, you really need to understand, get into that psyche a little bit. And so cybersecurity people are problem solvers. That's the skill that we look for. And in order to do that, you need to think differently. If we all think the same, we're all going to be approaching the same problem sets and only really protecting a certain fraction of our infrastructure. So a group of people that think differently and building genuine cognitive diversity into our cybersecurity professionals, I think, is the most important thing. And to the point of what we're doing about it, I think we're doing quite a lot, actually. So we've got an organisation called Cyber First, and they're intended to bring school-age girls into have an interest into cybersecurity, and so therefore they'll kind of go into further education. Whether someone needs a degree, no, I agree, they don't, and I kind of disagree with the premise of your question. I'm not sure that's what the industry is really filtering for. I think there's a certain sector of professionals that you come to a certain level, fine, but I'm not sure that is qualifies people out. On the security clearance front, I think we need to be careful that there's certain areas we can take more risk and there's certain areas that we can't. And we haven't introduced this term yet of defensive and offensive cyber. They're very different things. I won't bore you all with all the detail behind it. But in the spirit of it, defensive cyber is traditional cyber security, and offensive cyber is a bit more sensitive. And so where we're looking for kind of maybe taking some different risk appraisals to security clearance, I think we've got more opportunity to do so in our defensive cyber world, less so in offensive cyber. We can compartmentalise that. I think that's the gift of things like digital capabilities, is that we can compartmentalise and say, right, you're going to do that bit, and you can only see this much information. You can do this bit, and you've got access to much more sensitive information, and we can dissect and compartmentalise those capabilities. So I think we can do more, and I think we sort of are. It takes time. This is about managing risk, so it takes time, but I think the thinking seems to be progressing in the right direction.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to ask the final question for our last few minutes, which is about who are the developing, emerging, growing key allies of the future in the either bilaterally or in the organisations that we're members of. Obviously, we've seen a I think, a belated recognition of the way in which parts of Eastern and Central and Europe and the Baltics have developed in their heft, in policy terms, as well as military capacity. The war in Ukraine has obviously particularly focused that, but it will also mean that when the war ends, Ukraine, I think, will arguably have the largest, most intensely combat-tested military in the world. We will presumably see a period in which some of the tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops who've trained in the UK, in Sweden and elsewhere will potentially start to travel back in order to train our own militaries from their own experience, having used these technologies themselves on the front line in actual combat. Similarly, we've seen changes in, say, one thing we haven't touched on in this discussion is the role of India, where that sits between these various alliances. I can imagine the Indian military are probably watching slightly nervously, having bought at great expense an awful lot of Russian military technology in recent years, which may or may not be holding up to what was advertised. So where would you, and then obviously there's the cyber question as well, of where in the world these skills actually do sit, where they are being developed and so on. Where would each of you as a panel identify as the kind of, where we perhaps ought to be focusing when we're looking to the future shape of NATO, the next AUKUS, future alliances? Simon, you're not allowed to say that's an interesting question. That's not sufficient.
That's the first sentence gone then. Thank you. So I'm going to reverse your question, because I think I can.
That means asking me.
We are 10 years away from a bifurcation of the technology ecosystem and a battle between China and the West. And we are currently leaning into that now. Yeah, are you comfortable with your children using TikTok and the data that is in that system going to China and the Chinese Communist Party? We've had a battle in Parliament over Huawei and the rollout of 5G infrastructure in the country. This isn't just playing out in our country, this is playing out across the world. And it is becoming more heated and more difficult. So who are our allies? Our allies are the people who we win the hearts and minds of in this. Because data is, well, we hear it a lot, data is the new gold, but it is also a ripe ground for battle. And we need to convince as many countries as possible to side with us, not go with the cheap option, not go with the easy option, but actually go with the secure option, because we are all better for that. And it goes back to the point of building skills, but it goes to the point of building alliances. And AUKUS is a good example of that. It is not just about hard physical infrastructure, it is about the sharing of deep technical expertise as well on AI and on cyber, and building on the relationships that are already there in Five Eyes. So I think that is the battle ahead of us, and the allies we can have in that space are many and vast, but we need to be working on building those relationships now. And then on the physical side of things, I think it is a Pacific tilt. That is where we're heading to. AUKUS is a good example of it, but there are plenty of allies over there, and we know what the threats are, so that's where we need to be spending our diplomatic time and effort.
Thank you. John.
I think we'll always have our strongest relationships with allies that share our values and allies that we can confidently share information. So it's always have a strong relationship, but I think we need to think a little bit differently and be less exclusionary around what it is we want to achieve. So if we want, as I described earlier on, this is a global challenge, by taking an exclusionary view and saying, well, this group of people are going to sort of design what good looks like and tell the rest of the world, I'm not sure we're going to get very far. I think by determining what's the sort of minimum viable product of the thing we want to achieve, and being able to bring as much of the world with us as possible on that minimum viable product, but then aiming for more of an advanced product with our allies, but taking that kind of different view, I think would be for me a more nuanced approach.
Thank you very much, Malcolm.
This is a great issue to end the session on, I think, Mark. And of course, all the answers to your question will come in the integrated review next week. But let me at least prefigure what the integrated review will say. Look, I think, at least in relation to European security, we're in a sort of 1916 moment right now. And the idea in 1916 you could have written a 20-year projection of the balance of world power or what the priorities for UK defence and foreign policy should be would be absurd because you didn't know who was going to win the war. And I think in many ways we're at that moment. Now, we genuinely don't know what the outcome of the war in Ukraine. I can give you 4 or 5 different scenarios, but it'd be very difficult for me to attach probability to them. So there will come a time when the outcome of this war is clear, when we will need to have that reassessment. And right now it looks as if Ukraine and Poland and some others will emerge with much greater weight in NATO. But it rather depends on whether Ukraine wins. And we don't know that yet. That's still very much in the balance. The other point I think I would make is that we should be very aware of the fact that outside the West, most of the world's major powers are not on our side. They are not taking part in sanctions. They are sitting on the fence. They are looking after their interests. They don't understand, well, they don't agree with us that this is a fundamental challenge to global norms greater than the challenges they faced in South Asia or Africa or wherever it might be. And you look at the UNGA vote and it looks as if our case has had very strong support. But if you look at most of the countries with large populations, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Mexico, you go down the list, none of those countries are unequivocally on our side. Very successful in building that G7 plus alliance with the Japanese and the Australians and the Koreans, much less successful elsewhere. And it's not just because we haven't spoken loudly enough to them, it's just that they have a different concept of their interests. And it will remain so because we live in a post-colonial world and those countries determine their interests in their own ways according to their own culture and interests and so on. I thought James cleverly gave actually a very good speech, I think it was December, on the global middle ground, which I think had a good conceptualization of what the issue is and the need for us to build more relationships with the countries I just listed because our interests require that we do so, that we have better relationships with them, longer-term relationships with them, reliable relationships with them, which we haven't always done. And that's why I mean, I'm not sure if I agree with Simon that we are moving towards a bifurcated world. In some regards, we are. But actually, that global middle ground doesn't want to be in the Chinese camp any more than it wants to be in the Western camp. They want to be in the Indian camp or the Brazilian camp. They want to have as much room for maneuver as possible. So I suspect the world of the future isn't going to look like the Cold War, even if US-China relations continue to get worse, because we're going to have the question about our relationships with ASEAN and India and Africa and Latin America. And those relationships will have to be based on an acceptance of their right not to choose. And I don't know what that world looks like, but that's the essay question. I'm sure having reliable partnerships, doing what we say we will do is going to be a really important part of the UK offer there. Finally, I suspect, and we'll see what the integrated review says, and I think it's going to be an interim review most of all. I suspect one of the consequences of the war is that there will be of the war and COVID, is there'll be more emphasis on resilience than we've had. I'd be surprised if there wasn't. And I suspect there'll be rather less emphasis on the defense aspect of the Indo-Pacific tilt, because NATO is self-evidently the #1 priority right now. I don't think a massive shift, but those are two tilts I would certainly favor when the review comes out.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've selfishly overrun the time, so I should apologise to my events colleagues. I hope you'll join me in several thank yous to Sarah and Abigail, our events team at Concert of Home, who've arranged all of this today, to Angus and Paul Goodman, to Redstone Risk, who helped to support the event, and thank you all of you, but last but not least, our fantastic panel for such an interesting session. Thank you.
Some beautiful branding. Sure.